The scent of lavender-infused antiseptic and impending finality clung to the air, a perfume Ilara Vance, at 27, knew better than any lover's cologne. Her fingers, gentle and practiced, rested on the paper-thin skin of Mr. Henderson's hand, feeling the faint, thready pulse that was more memory than life. In the sterile quiet of the hospice room, punctuated only by the soft, rhythmic sigh of a ventilator, she was an anchor in a drifting sea, her calm presence a final, quiet gift. She offered comfort at the very edge of existence, a space where she felt both profoundly useful and entirely invisible. This was her world, a series of hushed goodbyes to people she had only just met, a life spent in the service of endings, while her own beginning felt indefinitely postponed. Her heart was a locked room, and she was the dutiful, solitary keeper of the key. If you want to know what happens when a woman who lives for others is forced to face her own hidden desires, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. The bus ride home was a descent from the sacred silence of her work into the jarring noise of the city. Ilara watched the blur of life outside the smudged window, couples laughing, friends arguing, strangers hurrying toward destinations filled with purpose. She felt like a phantom observing a world she couldn't touch. Her small apartment was a reflection of her inner state, meticulously clean, sparsely furnished and achingly quiet. A single place setting was laid out on her small table. A book lay open not with excitement, but as a shield against the echoing silence. She moved through the space with an economy of motion that spoke of long-practiced solitude. This wasn't a home, it was a holding cell, a place to recharge her professional empathy before returning to the emotional front lines, leaving nothing for the woman who lived there. Tonight, her reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed like a stranger. The face staring back had soft lines and weary eyes that held the ghosts of 100 patients. She traced the line of her own collarbone, her touch as clinical and impersonal as the one she offered at work. At 27, her body was an undiscovered country, its borders secured not by faith but by a fortress of duty built brick by brick since her youth. Her virginity was a quiet fact, a consequence of a life lived in the shadow of her mother's illness, where her own needs were deemed a luxury. She understood love as a form of caregiving, of sacrifice, but the raw, messy, selfish desire she read about in novels felt like a language she could never hope to speak, a fire she had never been allowed to feel. The worn, faded photograph on her nightstand was the source code of her restraint. It showed a teenage Ilara, her smile thin and forced, with her arm around her frail mother in a wheelchair. She remembered that day not for the sunshine, but for the metallic taste of her mother's medication she had to administer an hour later. Her adolescence had been a blur of monitoring vitals, changing bed linens, and mastering a composure far beyond her years. While other girls were experiencing their first kiss, their first heartbreak, Ilara was learning the precise dosage of morphine needed to dull intractable pain. She had traded her youth for her mother's comfort, a transaction she never questioned, but whose cost was etched into the deep-seated caution with which she navigated the world. Her profession was both a calling and a continuation of that early sacrifice. At the hospice, she was revered for her boundless patience and her almost supernatural ability to soothe the frightened and the dying. The structured protocols, the clean charts, the predictable progression of illness, these things provided a framework that kept her own unexamined emptiness at bay. She found a strange solace in the order of palliative care, a sense of purpose in easing the passage of others. Yet a creeping hollowness had begun to bloom in the quiet moments between shifts. She was an expert on the mechanics of the human body at its most vulnerable, but a complete novice when it came to the workings of her own heart, a heart that beat with a quiet, desperate plea for a life that was truly her own. The ache of this internal void was sharpest when she witnessed moments of unguarded intimacy. Today, it had been Mr. Henderson's grandson, a man her age, who had simply laid his head on his wife's shoulder in the hallway, his grief a raw, shared burden. The simple, unconscious gesture of her hand finding his struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. It was a casual, profound connection that felt more foreign to her than the complex medical terminology she used daily. A flicker of longing, hot and unfamiliar, coursed through her, a yearning for a touch that wasn't meant to check a pulse, a look that wasn't clouded by pain or gratitude. She immediately smothered the feeling, labeling it a selfish indulgence in a world where her role was to give, never to take. It was this deep, unacknowledged hunger for disruption that made her pause when the email arrived. The subject line was stark: private nursing position, Croft Estate. The offer was astronomical, the duties described with a cold corporate brevity. It spoke of a high-profile client, severe chronic pain management, and a remote live-in requirement at a cliffside estate. It was a world, away from the humble, anonymous service of the hospice. Her first instinct was to delete it, to retreat back into the safety of her known, ordered existence. But her finger hovered over the mouse. The words remote, isolated, and private didn't sound like a prison. They sounded like a space where the crushing weight of her familiar life might finally be different, a place where the ghost in the apartment might have a chance to become a person. The part of the city Ilara called home was a patchwork of faded brick and stoic resilience. Here life spilled out onto the cracked sidewalks and narrow streets, a constant low hum of existence that felt both communal and suffocating. Laundry lines stretched between buildings like makeshift banners, broadcasting the intimate details of 100 different lives. The air was a thick tapestry of smells: fried onions from one window, cheap perfume from a passing teenager, the faint, ever-present scent of exhaust from the city buses. As she walked from the bus stop, she kept her gaze down, avoiding the knowing glances of neighbors who had watched her grow from a serious girl into a quiet woman. They saw her as a monument to filial duty, a local saint in comfortable shoes, and their silent approval felt heavier than any judgment. Her apartment building was a vertical extension of the neighborhood's character, its hallways echoing with the sounds of lives lived too closely together. Thin walls carried the muffled arguments of the couple next door, the crying of a baby on the floor below, and the blare of a television from across the hall. Privacy was a scarce commodity, a luxury she could not afford. This constant proximity to others only amplified her profound sense of isolation, making her feel like a ghost haunting the periphery of real, messy, vibrant human connection. She would nod politely to Mrs. Gable in the hallway, her neighbor of 5 years, but their exchanges never went beyond the weather. It was easier that way safer to remain a polite enigma than to risk revealing the vast, silent emptiness she carried within her. The shrill ring of the telephone was a familiar intrusion, a summons back to a world of obligation. It was her Aunt Carol, her mother's sister, whose voice was a cocktail of genuine concern and ingrained traditionalism. The conversation followed a script Ilara knew by heart. It began with questions about her work, quickly pivoted to her single status, and inevitably landed on the topic of settling down. To her aunt, Ilara's life was a problem to be solved, her solitude a temporary state before the inevitable arrival of a nice, stable man. Each word was a subtle chisel, chipping away at Ilara's fragile sense of self, reinforcing the idea that her worth was contingent on a future she did not want, and a partnership she could not imagine. She was being groomed for a life that felt like a replica of her mother's, minus the illness. After the call, she sat at her small kitchen table and sorted through the day's mail, a ritual that always left a bitter taste in her mouth. Beneath the grocery store flyers and junk mail were the stark white envelopes that mattered. The hospital's modest paycheck barely covered rent and utilities, let alone the lingering medical debts from her mother's final years, a financial ghost that haunted her bank account. This quiet, persistent pressure was a constant undercurrent in her life, a reminder that she was not truly free. Every decision was weighed against this burden, every small pleasure scrutinized for its cost. The astronomical salary mentioned in the Croft Estate email was more than a number. It was a lifeline, a potential escape from this inherited prison of debt that kept her tethered to a life of careful, measured survival. A small silver locket on her dresser held the true architecture of her confinement. Inside was a tiny, worn picture of her mother, smiling a tired but genuine smile. Ilara remembered the day it was taken, her mother's brief period of remission. She had promised her then, in the quiet of a sunlit afternoon, that she would always be a good daughter, that she would never be a burden. That promise, made by a teenager desperate for her mother's approval, had become the central tenet of her existence. It had guided her career choice, her social life or lack thereof, and her deliberate retreat from any form of romantic entanglement. She had so thoroughly absorbed her mother's fear of the world and her belief in sacrifice that her own desires had atrophied from neglect, deemed too selfish to ever be acknowledged. The pressure to marry was not just from her aunt. It was an unspoken expectation woven into the fabric of her community. She saw it in the hopeful eyes of her relatives when they introduced her to the sons of their friends, solid, dependable men with steady jobs and kind, uninteresting faces. In their world, a woman of her age was meant to be a wife and mother, and her dedication to her career was seen as a noble but temporary placeholder. The idea filled her with a quiet dread. She imagined a life of comfortable predictability, of shared meals in silence, of a physical intimacy born of duty rather than passion. It would be a different kind of hospice, a slow, gentle easing into an emotional death, and she wasn't sure which fate was more terrifying, to die alone or to live a life that was not her own. Her evenings were a fortress of routine, a series of small, repetitive tasks that kept the chaos of her own thoughts at bay. She would wash her single plate, fork and glass with meticulous care, scrubbing away any trace of the day. The scent of bleach as she wiped down her counters was sharp and purifying, a chemical absolution. She would fold her laundry into perfect, neat squares, creating order in the one domain she could fully control. This relentless tidiness was her armor. It was a physical manifestation of her internal state, a way to manage the unruly mess of longing and loneliness that threatened to overwhelm her. As long as everything in her apartment was in its proper place, she could pretend that her heart was not in a state of complete and utter disarray. Her younger sister, Maya, was a vibrant, chaotic force that occasionally blew through Ilara's ordered world via a crackling video call. Maya lived 3 states away, her life a whirlwind of art school, questionable boyfriends, and impulsive decisions. She spoke of heartbreak and passion with a casual familiarity that made Ilara feel ancient and alien. "You need to live a little, Ellie," Maya would say, her face earnest on the small phone screen. "You can't just take care of everyone else forever." The advice was well-meaning, but it created a chasm between them. Maya couldn't understand that Ilara's role as the responsible one wasn't a choice she had made, but a mold she had been poured into, one that had long since hardened around her. This persona of the selfless caregiver was a heavy cloak she could never remove. The neighbors, her distant family, her few colleagues, they all saw the same person, Ilara Vance, the good daughter, the patient nurse, the woman who asked for nothing and gave everything. This reputation, earned through years of quiet sacrifice, had become its own form of imprisonment. To deviate from it, to show anger, to express a selfish desire, to make a decision purely for herself, would be a betrayal of the image everyone had of her. It would be a public failure. She felt the weight of their collective expectation pressing down on her, forcing her to play a role she had mastered but had come to despise, leaving her to wonder who, if anyone, she was underneath the costume. That night, she found herself staring at the email from the Croft estate once more. The cold, impersonal words on the screen felt like a transmission from another universe, a place unbound by the suffocating gravity of her life. Private, remote, confidential. These weren't just job descriptors, they were promises. The money was a practical lure, a solution to her financial chains, but the true temptation lay in the possibility of anonymity. On that isolated cliffside estate, no one would know her as the saintly daughter or the quiet nurse. She would be a stranger, an unknown quantity. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something wild and reckless ignite within her, the terrifying, exhilarating thought that in a place so far, removed from her world, she might finally have the chance to discover who she was when no one was watching. The drive to the Croft estate was a slow ascent into another reality, a world of manicured green and old money that felt as alien to Ilara as a foreign planet. The taxi wound its way up a private serpentine road carved into the cliffside, leaving the familiar grit of the city far below. With each turn, the view of the churning grey ocean became more expansive, more intimidating. Finally, the house came into view. It was not a warm, inviting mansion, but a stark monument of glass, steel, and dark stone that seemed to jut out from the rock face itself, defying the turbulent sea below. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, designed to keep the world at a safe, unbridgeable distance. Ilara's hand tightened on the strap of her worn satchel, her heart pounding a nervous, unsteady rhythm against her ribs. Stepping inside was like entering a vacuum. The air was cool, still and silent, the kind of profound quiet that absorbs all sound. The foyer was a cavernous space with soaring ceilings and polished black marble floors that reflected her timid form like a dark, distorted mirror. Sunlight streamed through a two-story wall of glass, illuminating a space that was meticulously clean, yet utterly devoid of life or warmth. There were no photographs, no scattered magazines, no personal trinkets, only a few severe pieces of modern art that seemed to amplify the echoing emptiness. It was the home of a ghost, a sterile, beautiful prison where every surface gleamed with a lonely, untouchable perfection. Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, a sense of profound isolation radiating from the very bones of the house. She was not greeted by Julian Croft, but by a severe-looking woman in a crisp grey uniform who introduced herself as Mrs. Davenport, the estate manager. Her welcome was a thinly veiled interrogation, her eyes scanning Ilara's simple dress and sensible shoes with a flicker of disapproval. "Mr. Croft does not tolerate incompetence," she stated, her voice as starched as her collar. "Your predecessors failed to understand the complexities of the position. He requires absolute discretion and expects you to be invisible unless summoned. Your duties are strictly medical. Do not attempt to engage him in personal conversation. Is that understood?" The words were a clear warning, painting a picture of a difficult, volatile patient and reinforcing Ilara's status as an outsider, a temporary fixture in a world where she did not belong. Mrs. Davenport left her standing in the center of a vast living room, a space so large her small apartment could fit into one corner of it. A wall of glass offered a panoramic, terrifyingly beautiful view of the storm-tossed ocean crashing against the rocks below. The raw, violent power of the sea was a stark contrast to the controlled, sterile environment inside. Ilara felt small and exposed, a solitary figure dwarfed by the scale of the room and the weight of the silence. She resisted the urge to fidget, instead focusing on her breathing, a familiar technique she used to calm anxious patients. She waited, listening to the distant roar of the waves and the frantic beating of her own heart, bracing herself for the confrontation she knew was coming. For the man who was as broken and formidable as his cliffside home, he appeared without a sound, a shadow detaching itself from a darker hallway. Julian Croft was taller than she had imagined, with a presence that seemed to suck the very air from the room. He wore a simple black cashmere sweater and dark trousers, clothes that spoke of understated wealth, but hung on a frame that was too thin, too rigid with tension. One side of his face, the side turned away from the light, was a roadmap of pale, jagged scars that pulled at the corner of his eye and lip, giving his handsome features a permanent, cruel sneer. He moved with a deliberate, pained stiffness that he tried to mask with an air of authority. His eyes, a startlingly intense shade of blue, were cold and assessing as they landed on her, devoid of any welcome or warmth. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, gravelly rasp, laced with a weary cynicism that seemed to bone deep. "So, you're the next one," he said, not as a question, but as a flat statement of fact. He didn't move closer, keeping a vast expanse of marble floor between them, like a defensive moat. "The hospice saint, sent here to offer quiet platitudes and hold my hand until I find a more dignified way to rot. Tell me, Nurse Vance, does your boundless empathy extend to men who have earned their misery, or do you reserve it for the blameless and the meek?" His words were a calculated strike, designed to provoke, to find the crack in her professional facade and shatter it before she could even begin. He was testing her, daring her to run. Ilara met his cold, challenging gaze without flinching, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She kept her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her posture calm and open. "My empathy, Mr. Croft, extends to anyone in pain," she replied, her voice steady and clear, carrying across the silent room with surprising force. "My job is not to judge how that pain was acquired. It's to help you manage it." She did not offer a placating smile or a nervous apology. She simply stated her purpose, her professionalism, a shield against his verbal assault. She saw a flicker of surprise in his piercing blue eyes, a momentary disruption in his carefully constructed armor of contempt. He had expected her to cower or to offer pity, and her simple, direct refusal to do either had clearly unsettled him. A long, charged silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. He continued to scrutinize her, his gaze sweeping over her as if trying to find a weakness, a flaw he could exploit. She, in turn, allowed herself to truly see him, not as the ruthless mogul from the tabloids or the monster Mrs. Davenport had described, but as a man trapped in a relentless cycle of suffering. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the subtle tremor in his hand as he held it rigidly at his side, the profound, aching loneliness that radiated from him, more potent than his anger. In that silent moment, a strange, invisible current passed between them, not of attraction, but of recognition. Shared understanding of isolation, seen from two vastly different shores. "Your file says you're competent," he finally clipped out, turning away from her abruptly. The moment of connection, if it had ever existed, was severed. He led her towards a discreetly hidden wing of the house, his limp more pronounced now that he was moving. The space was a state-of-the-art medical suite, filled with monitors, IV stands, and an array of pharmaceutical equipment that looked jarringly out of place amidst the estate's luxury. He spoke of his own condition with a chilling detachment, listing medications, nerve reactions, and pain thresholds, as if he were discussing a faulty piece of machinery. "Your primary responsibility is the evening dosage. It must be administered precisely at 10. Any deviation has consequences." He spoke of his own body as his enemy, a thing to be managed and controlled, not healed. He dismissed her with a curt nod, retreating back into the shadowy depths of the house, without another word. Ilara was left alone in the medical suite, the scent of antiseptic a strange and familiar comfort in this alien environment. The weight of her task settled on her shoulders, heavier than she could have imagined. It wasn't just about managing his physical pain, it was about navigating the vast, treacherous landscape of his grief and self-hatred. As she began to methodically organize the medical supplies, her hands steady despite the tremor she felt inside, she understood that Julian Croft was the most challenging patient of her life. A deep, unsettling curiosity had taken root, a dangerous desire to understand the man behind the scars, the coldness, and the profound, isolating pain. The nights at Croft Estate settled into a tense, fragile rhythm, governed by the precise schedule of Julian's pain medication. At 10 o'clock sharp, Ilara would enter his private wing, the sterile click of her shoes on the marble floor the only announcement of her arrival. She moved, with a quiet efficiency that had become her armor, her focus fixed on the vials and syringes that formed a temporary barrier between them. He would watch her from his chair, a silent, brooding figure cloaked in shadows, his intense blue eyes following her every move. It was not the gaze of a patient observing a caregiver, but that of a predator studying an enigma, trying to find the flaw in her impenetrable calm. The air in the room was always thick with unspoken questions, a suffocating silence. That was more intimate than any conversation could ever be. He tested her constantly, his words honed into sharp, intellectual barbs. During the administration of his medication, he would launch into cynical monologues about mortality, the futility of hope, or the inherent selfishness of altruism. He was trying to provoke her, to crack the serene professionalism she wore like a uniform. "Tell me, Nurse Vance," he'd rasp, his voice a low growl of contained agony. "Do you get a thrill from this? From watching a man disintegrate piece by piece? Is it a sense of power or just a morbid curiosity?" Ilara never rose to the bait. She would simply meet his gaze, her expression unreadable, and reply with a quiet, clinical question about his pain levels, her refusal to engage in his war of words a more effective defense than any argument. Her stillness infuriated and intrigued him in equal measure. In the quiet hours after his medication had taken hold, when a fragile truce settled over the house, Ilara began to see the man behind the monster. She noticed the small things, the way his hand, the one that wasn't scarred, would clench around a leather-bound book as if it were a lifeline, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor that ran through him when he thought she wasn't looking, a testament to the constant grinding war being waged within his own body. She saw the profound exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, a weariness that went far beyond physical pain. He was a man, drowning in silence, and his cruelty was not a weapon but a desperate, frantic thrashing to keep from going under. This realization didn't frighten her. It awoke a deeper, more dangerous form of empathy within her. The first significant crack in his fortress appeared on a Tuesday, a night when the coastal wind howled against the glass walls of the estate like a grieving banshee. His pain was visibly worse, a raw, electric agony that his usual dosage couldn't touch. As she adjusted his intravenous drip, her movements calm and practiced, a low guttural sound escaped his lips, a sound of pure, unguarded suffering that sliced through the room. It was the first time she had heard him make a sound that wasn't a word, a cynical remark or a command. It was the sound of his soul, raw and exposed. Without thinking, she paused, her hand hovering near his arm, and whispered, "I'm here, Mr. Croft. Just breathe." The words were a simple reflex from her hospice work, but in this house, they felt like a profound transgression. He reacted as if she had struck him, his body going rigid. "I don't need you here," he snarled, his voice tight with a mixture of pain and fury, but his eyes, for a fleeting second, betrayed him. In their depths, she saw not anger, but a stark, desperate terror. It was the fear of a man who had forgotten what human comfort felt like, who saw any offer of kindness as a prelude to a more devastating abandonment. He was pushing her away, not because he hated her, but because the flicker of warmth she offered was more terrifying to him than the familiar, freezing darkness he inhabited. She understood then that his fortress was not meant to keep others out, but to keep his own brokenness in, and she had just found a loose stone in the wall. Later that night, long after the supplemental medication had eased the worst of the storm inside him, he spoke into the quiet darkness of the room. "She used to love the rain," he said, his voice a hollow whisper, devoid of its usual sharp edges. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Ilara knew he was speaking of his late fiancée. It was a fragment of a memory, a tiny, precious piece of his shattered heart offered up into the space between them. She didn't respond with platitudes or questions. She simply stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, her silent presence an acknowledgement of his grief, a shared vigil in the dim light. The air had changed between them. A fragile seed of trust had been planted in the barren ground of his despair. Their strange, unspoken relationship began to evolve in the daylight hours. She would find him in the estate's vast two-story library, a cathedral of books that seemed to be his only sanctuary. He would be engrossed in texts on ancient philosophy or complex physics, his mind a fierce, burning thing that refused to be extinguished by his body's betrayal. He would pretend not to notice her as she came in to check the room's humidifier or bring him a glass of water, but she could feel his awareness of her, a subtle shift in the room's energy. She, in turn, found herself studying the titles on his shelves, trying to piece together the map of his mind, to understand the intellectual landscape of the man who was becoming the most complex puzzle she had ever faced. One afternoon, their silent dance was broken. He was standing by the towering glass wall in the main living area, staring out at the turbulent grey sea, a solitary figure against the vast dramatic backdrop. She was passing through the hallway on her way to the kitchen when she felt his gaze turn from the ocean to her. She stopped, her heart suddenly beating a little faster. Their eyes met across the expanse of polished marble. It was a long, charged moment, devoid of hostility or professional distance. In his look, she saw a raw, questioning vulnerability. In hers, he saw an empathy that was not pity, but a profound, unsettling recognition. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them suspended in that silent, electric gaze, a man and a woman on the precipice of something terrifying and new. The tension between them began to find a new outlet: conversation. No longer content with cynical one-liners, Julian started to engage her in complex, challenging debates. He would question her about her beliefs, her work, her view of the world, his inquiries sharp and probing, designed to dissect her and expose her as naive. He talked about the cold mathematical beauty of the universe, the cruel indifference of nature, the illusion of purpose. He was trying to intellectually dismantle the quiet faith in humanity that she embodied. He expected her to crumble, to offer simple, sentimental answers he could easily tear apart. He was using his formidable intellect as his last line of defense, a way to keep her at a safe, analytical distance. But Ilara did not crumble. She met his intellectual fire not with sentiment, but with the quiet, profound wisdom she had earned in the trenches of human suffering. When he spoke of the indifference of the universe, she spoke of the fierce, defiant love she had witnessed in a dying man's last glance at his wife. When he argued for the meaninglessness of existence, she described the simple, sacred purpose of holding a stranger's hand as they took their final breath. Her answers were not philosophical abstractions, they were truths forged in the crucible of real life and death. Her gentle resilience disarmed him. For the first time he was faced with a strength that his intellect could not conquer and his cynicism could not corrode. He was starting to lose the war he himself had declared. These conversations became their new ritual, a dangerous and intoxicating dance of minds. They were a form of intimacy that was safer than a touch, yet in some ways more revealing. Through their verbal sparring, she glimpsed the brilliant, passionate man who existed before the accident, the visionary who had built an empire from nothing. He, in turn, saw beyond the quiet, dutiful nurse to the woman of extraordinary strength and emotional intelligence who stood before him. They were mapping each other's souls, word by word, debate by debate. The professional line between them had not just blurred. It had been redrawn into a complex, intricate pattern of mutual fascination and a deep, unspoken need that thrummed just beneath the surface of their every exchange. The fragile peace of this intellectual courtship was shattered when a new physical therapy regimen was prescribed to combat the increasing atrophy in his legs and back. The regimen required hands-on assistance, a task that fell to Ilara. The clinical instructions from the therapist, stabilize the hip, apply gentle counterpressure to the lumbar spine, were a world away from the shocking reality of the act itself. The first time she had to lay her hands on him, to physically touch the man she had only ever connected with through words and glances, the air in the room crackled with an almost unbearable tension. She felt the heat of his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt, a living, breathing warmth that sent a tremor through her own hands. As her fingers made contact with the tense, knotted muscles of his back, a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity shot through her. It was a feeling so foreign, so powerful, it nearly made her gasp. This was not the clinical, impersonal touch she gave to her patients. This was different. She could feel the coiled power in him, the deep, shuddering breaths he took as he fought to remain still under her hands. The scent of his skin, a clean, masculine scent, mixed with the faint aroma of antiseptic, filled her senses, overwhelming her. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls around her own heart, the fortress of duty and restraint she had lived in her entire life, began to crumble into dust. A wild, terrifying desire, a feeling she had only ever read about, bloomed hot and urgent in her chest. She could feel the violent battle raging within him. His entire body went rigid at her touch, a reflexive flinch of a man who had not known gentle contact for over a year. Yet, he did not pull away. He forced himself to endure it, his jaw clenched, his breathing shallow and ragged. Through the thin material of his shirt, she could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart, a rhythm that seemed to echo her own. It was a profound, shared vulnerability, a silent admission of a need so deep it terrified them both. In that sterile medical moment, surrounded by equipment and charts, something primal and deeply human was unleashed between them, a powerful current of longing that threatened to sweep them both away into uncharted, dangerous waters. After that first session, the atmosphere in the estate became thick with a new, palpable awareness. The intellectual debates ceased, replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. They moved around, each other like celestial bodies caught in a powerful invisible orbit, unable to connect yet incapable of pulling away. Every accidental brush of their hands as she passed him a glass of water, every lingering glance across the dinner table, was freighted with the memory of that touch. Ilara was in turmoil. The desire she felt for him was a profound betrayal of everything she thought she was: a good daughter, a professional nurse, a woman in control. She was terrified of the feeling, yet a part of her, a part she had suppressed for years, felt exhilaratingly, dangerously alive for the first time. This new, fragile and unspoken connection was a secret garden they had cultivated in the desolate landscape of the estate. But they were not the only ones who noticed the change in the atmosphere. Mrs. Davenport began to watch Ilara with a new, sharpened suspicion, her thin lips pressed into a line of constant disapproval. Phone calls from Julian's family, which he usually ignored, became more frequent and insistent. The outside world, with its judgments, its rules, and its own cruel intentions, was beginning to sense a shift in the balance of power within the fortress. The fragile intimacy Alara and Julian had built was about to be put to the test. Threatened by forces far more calculated and cold-blooded than his own inner demons, the storm that had been gathering on the horizon for days finally broke, unleashing its fury upon the cliffside estate. The wind shrieked and rain lashed against the glass walls, a violent, chaotic symphony that mirrored the escalating turmoil within the house. The change in barometric pressure sent Julian's chronic pain spiraling into an unbearable crescendo. Alara found him in his room, curled on his side, his body trembling with a level of agony she had never witnessed before. His face was pale and slick with sweat, his eyes squeezed shut in a desperate attempt to block out the world. The professional barrier between them evaporated in the face of his raw, visceral suffering. This was not nurse and patient anymore. This was a man at the absolute end of his rope, and she was the only person in the world left to hold on. He was barely lucid, his words a broken, feverish whisper. He spoke of twisted metal, the scent of gasoline, and the horrifying silence that followed the crash. He called out a woman's name, his voice cracking with a year's worth of unshed grief. Alara knew with a chilling certainty that this night would be the turning point. The carefully controlled doses and professional distance were no longer enough. The dam of his pain and guilt was breaking, and she was about to be swept away in the flood. As she prepared a syringe with the strongest possible sedative, her hands steady despite the frantic pounding of her own heart, she knew that by dawn the line she had fought so hard to maintain would be gone forever, and she would have to face the terrifying consequences of what lay on the other side. The sedative she administered did little to quell the storm inside him, only pulling him from the jagged depths of his traumatic memories into a state of raw, exhausted awareness. By morning, a fragile calm had descended, both outside and within the house. Alara moved through her duties in a haze, the professional boundaries she had so carefully maintained, now feeling like a cruel and flimsy fiction. She had seen the core of his soul, and there was no unseeing it. The ultimatum from his family, a cold legal document she had placed on her dresser, now felt like a death sentence for a part of her she had only just discovered. She packed her small, worn suitcase with a methodical slowness, each folded shirt a separate act of grief. She was choosing the safety of her old life, the sterile loneliness she knew over the beautiful, terrifying chaos he represented. He found her standing by the open doorway of her room, the suitcase a silent, damning piece of evidence at her feet. He wasn't. Leaning on the doorframe with his usual air of weary cynicism, he stood in the middle of the hall, his posture rigid, his face a pale, taut mask of disbelief. The storm had passed, but the air around him crackled with a far more dangerous energy. His piercing blue eyes, stripped of their usual defenses, were wide with a stark animal panic. He looked from her face to the bag and back again, the simple equation of her departure forming a conclusion that seemed to shatter something deep within him. For a moment he said nothing, the silence in the hallway a screaming void, a chasm opening between the life she was abandoning and the one she was retreating to. "So this is it then," he finally spoke, his voice a low, ragged thing, devoid of its usual cutting edge. It was the voice of a man who had been gutted. "The saint has found her limit. Was it the screaming, the nightmares? Or did you finally decide that a broken man isn't worth the paycheck?" Each question was a blow, but they lacked his typical venom. They were not accusations. They were the desperate, flailing attempts of a drowning man trying to understand why the lifeline was being pulled away. He was not trying to drive her away with cruelty this time. He was begging her, in the only way he knew how, to tell him that he was wrong, to give him a reason to believe that she was different from all the others who had walked away. Ilara's throat was tight, the words she needed to explain, the contract, his family, the threat to her career, all caught behind a dam of unshed tears. To tell him the truth would be to declare war on his family, to implicate herself in his world in a way from which there was no return. So she remained silent, her stillness a betrayal she could not voice. She could only look at him, her own heartbreak reflected in her wide, pleading eyes, hoping he could somehow read the truth she was too afraid to speak. But he saw only her packed bag and her silence, and in the ruins of his own past he could interpret them only one way. as the final ultimate act of abandonment. The hope that had flickered to life in his chest over the past weeks was being brutally extinguished before his eyes. In 3 long, unsteady strides, he closed the distance between them, his movement a torrent of desperation that broke through his usual pained stiffness. He reached for her, not with anger, but with a raw, possessive need that stole the air from her lungs. His hand closed around her upper arm, his grip firm but not painful, a desperate anchor in a world that was tilting off its axis. The heat of his touch seared through the thin fabric of her sleeve, a direct jolt to her very core. She could feel the tremor in his fingers, the frantic, thundering pulse in his wrist that matched the frantic beating of her own heart. The vast, empty estate shrank until it was only this, the charged, impossible space between their bodies, a universe of unspoken things crackling in the air. "Don't," he whispered, the single word a raw, broken plea. His face was inches from hers now, his gaze intense, searching, and stripped of all pretense. "Don't leave me," he swallowed, the sound raw and audible in the silence. "You are the only thing, the only one who makes the silence bearable. Before you, this house was a tomb. I was just waiting to die in it." His confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, terrifying truth. It was the ultimate admission of vulnerability from a man who had used his strength and his cruelty like a shield for his entire life. He was showing her the gaping mortal wound in his soul, trusting her, and only her, with the power to either save him or destroy him completely. Her carefully constructed resolve, the years of self-denial and dutiful sacrifice, crumbled into dust at the sound of his broken voice. The nurse, the daughter, the timid, cautious woman she had always been, they all receded, swept away by a tidal wave of emotion, so powerful it felt like it could tear her apart. This was not about a job or a patient anymore. This was about the profound elemental connection between 2 broken people who had found a fragile solace in each other's darkness. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a slow path down her cheek, a silent surrender to the truth she could no longer deny. She loved this difficult, wounded, impossible man, and the thought of leaving him was a physical agony, a tearing of her own soul. He saw the tear, and it was as if he was seeing the sun for the first time after a year of endless night. His expression softened, the desperation replaced by a dawning, incredulous wonder. He had expected her to pull away, to offer a professional platitude, to finish the act of leaving. He had not expected this silent, shared grief. His gaze, so full of pain just moments before, now held a new, intense focus. It dropped from her tear-streaked eyes to her lips, and in that look, Ilara felt the entire world shift. The sounds of the house, the distant cry of a gull, the hum of the ventilation, it all faded into a dull roar. All that existed was the raw, undeniable truth in his eyes, and the magnetic pull that was drawing them inexorably, terrifyingly closer. He leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. She couldn't. When his lips met hers, it was not a gentle exploration, but a collision, a desperate, hungry claiming. It was the kiss of a man starved for comfort, and the kiss of a woman awakening to a lifetime of suppressed desire. It was clumsy and urgent, filled with the salt of her tears and the raw, unspoken grief of the past year. His unscarred hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek with a reverence that made her tremble. She arched into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. It was a kiss that broke every rule, every boundary, every last defense they both had left. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The air was thick with the aftermath of the storm they had unleashed. The transgression was complete, an irrevocable act that had burned the bridge back to their old lives. He was no longer just her patient. She was no longer just his nurse. They were 2 souls, stripped bare, standing in the ruins of their carefully constructed fortresses. He looked at her, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't yet name, and she looked back, her fear and desire warring within her. Her bag was still packed by the door, a relic of a decision made in another lifetime, but she knew with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty that she was not going anywhere. The aftermath of the kiss was not a tender exploration, but a sudden chilling void. Julian pulled back as if burned, the raw desperation in his eyes instantly replaced by a shuttered, horrified clarity. The fortress walls he had allowed to crumble slammed back into place, higher and more impenetrable than before. He looked at her tear-stained face and trembling lips, and she saw not the echo of shared passion, but the cold glint of self-loathing. He had exposed a part of himself he deemed monstrously weak, and she was the unforgivable witness to his lapse. The heat that had flooded her veins turned to ice as he took a single deliberate step back, severing the last thread of their connection and leaving her stranded in the wreckage of the moment they had created. The silence that followed was a condemnation, louder than any angry word he could have spoken. His retreat was a physical manifestation of his rejection. He turned from her without a word, his body once again rigid with the pained stiffness she knew so well. A suit of armor he was hastily reassembling. He did not look back. He simply walked away, his retreating form a final, brutal dismissal that left her standing alone in the hallway, the air still thick, with the ghost of his touch and the scent of his skin. The packed suitcase at her feet, once a symbol of her agonizing choice, now felt like a prop in a tragedy she had authored. The kiss had not been a bridge between their two lonely worlds. It had been a detonation, and he had fled the blast zone, leaving her to face the fallout alone. The profound intimacy of his confession felt like a fever dream, erased by the cold, hard reality of his back turning against her. Ilara remained frozen in the hallway, her body a battleground of conflicting sensations. The imprint of his lips was a phantom fire on hers, while a deep, cavernous cold spread through her chest. The emotional whiplash was dizzying, leaving her breathless and disoriented. Guilt, sharp and acidic, flooded her senses. She had violated every professional and ethical boundary she had ever held sacred. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had measured dosages and checked vitals, and saw them as instruments of transgression. She had offered comfort, and then crossed an invisible line into something far more dangerous. The vast, silent house, which for a brief time had felt like a shared sanctuary, now seemed to press in on her, its sterile walls a jury box, its echoing quiet a verdict of guilty. The true consequence arrived not with a shout, but with the soft, deliberate click of Mrs. Davenport's sensible heels on the marble floor. The estate manager appeared at the end of the hall, her expression a mask of cold, triumphant vindication. She didn't need to have seen the kiss. She could read the entire sordid story in the charged atmosphere, in Ilara's disheveled emotional state, and in the conspicuous absence of Mr. Croft. "Your services are no longer required, Miss Vance," she stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. "A car is waiting to take you to the city. Your final payment and a non-disclosure agreement will be couriered to you. Please collect your things immediately." It was not a dismissal. It was an exorcism, a swift and merciless cleansing of the unwanted influence that had dared to breach the estate's sterile defenses. The drive down the serpentine cliffside road was a silent, surreal descent. Ilara sat numbly in the back of the black sedan, watching the fortress of glass and steel recede, until it was just a sharp, lonely silhouette against the grey sky. The raw, churning ocean that had once seemed a reflection of Julian's inner turmoil now felt like a mirror of her own. She had been cast out, exiled from the one place where she had felt the stirrings of a life that was truly her own. She clutched her worn satchel on her lap, a pathetic anchor in the sea of her confusion and grief. She was no longer a nurse, no longer a caregiver in that house. She was just a woman who had dared to touch a broken soul and had been shattered in the process, a ghost being banished back to a world where she had always been invisible. Returning to her small apartment was like stepping back into a life that no longer fit. The meticulous order, the single place setting on the table, the profound, empty quiet. It all felt alien, a relic from a person she no longer was. The suffocating safety she had once craved now felt like a prison cell. She unpacked her suitcase with robotic movements, each folded item a fresh wave of agony. This was the life she had been fighting to protect, this sterile, lonely existence. The irony was a physical pain in her chest. She had flown too, close to a burning star, and had been sent plummeting back to this colorless earth. The silence in her apartment was no longer a peaceful shield. It was a hollow, aching void, filled with the echo of a broken man's plea and the memory of a kiss that had cost her everything. Meanwhile, Julian was entombed in his library, the towering shelves of books a barricade against the world. He tried to lose himself in the cold, hard logic of physics, but the words blurred into a meaningless scrawl. The memory of the kiss was a relentless assault on his senses, the softness of her lips, the taste of her tears, the way she had clung to him as if he were a lifeline. His rejection of her had been a violent, self-preservation instinct, a desperate attempt to kill the hope she had ignited before it could destroy him completely. But now, in the crushing silence of her absence, he understood his catastrophic error. He hadn't protected himself. He had merely resealed his own tomb. The silence was no longer a state of being. It was an active, malevolent presence, screaming her name in every empty corner of the house. For days, Ilara existed in a fog of shame and recrimination. She saw herself as a reckless fool who had mistaken a patient's vulnerability for something more. She replayed the scene in the hallway, his desperate confession and her own overwhelming response, and saw it not as a moment of pure connection, but as a catastrophic failure of her professional duty. She had let her own starved heart dictate her actions, and in doing so had likely caused irreparable harm to the man she was supposed to be healing. She was a disgrace. The good, dutiful daughter, the compassionate nurse. That person was a fraud. She ignored the insistent buzzing of her phone, the calls from her aunt and her sister, a painful reminder of a world and a self she no longer recognized, adrift in the wreckage of her own choices. But slowly, through the suffocating layers of guilt, a new emotion began to smolder, a quiet, burning anger. It was not directed at Julian, but at the cold, calculating forces that had engineered this catastrophe. She thought of Mrs. Davenport's smug expression, of the cruel, legalistic language of the ultimatum. They hadn't been trying to protect Julian from her. They had been trying to protect their control over him. They wanted him broken, manageable, a wounded king on a leash. Her kiss, her connection with him, had not been a transgression. It had been an act of rebellion. It was a moment of pure, unvarnished truth in a world built on power and lies. The fear that had paralyzed her began to transform into a steely, unfamiliar resolve. She had not been weak. She had been human. On the third night, she stood before her bathroom mirror and truly looked at herself for the first time since her return. The face that stared back was not the timid, weary nurse she remembered. Her eyes, though shadowed with grief, held a new depth, a flicker of a fire that had been kindled on that cliffside. The fortress she had built around her heart had not been destroyed. It had been breached, and through the cracks, a new and formidable strength was pouring in. She finally understood that the choice was never about her safety versus her desire. It was about choosing to fight for a connection that mattered more than any rule or reputation. Abandoning him now would not be an act of self-preservation. It would be the ultimate act of cowardice. A quiet, unshakable certainty settled in her soul. She had to go back, not as his nurse but as his equal. The small rented car she drove was an unfamiliar machine, a vessel of pure intention propelling her forward. She did not drive back to the Croft estate as the timid nurse who had fled. She returned as a woman who had finally claimed ownership of her own heart. She had packed a single bag, not with the sensible uniforms of her former life, but with the few things that felt truly hers: a worn copy of a poetry book, a soft wool sweater, and the silver locket from her dresser, its clasp now empty. The picture of her mother was tucked safely in her wallet, a memory honored but no longer a chain. With each mile that devoured the distance back to the coast, she felt the ghosts of her past receding, replaced by the terrifying, exhilarating roar of an unknown future. She was driving into the heart of the storm, not to tame it, but to find her place within it. The imposing iron gates of the estate were just as she remembered them, a stark black barrier between two worlds. She pulled the car to a stop, the engine's soft hum the only sound breaking the coastal silence. She did not get out. She did not press the button on the intercom. She simply sat, her hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, and waited. This was not a plea for entry. It was a declaration. Her presence was her answer to the ultimatum, her response to his rejection, her final, unwavering statement of intent. The sky above was a canvas of bruised purple and grey, the air heavy with the promise of more rain, but in the small, quiet space of the car, Ilara felt a profound and unshakable calm. She had made her choice, and all that was left was to see if he had the courage to make his. Inside the glass fortress, Julian saw her. He had been staring at the bank of security monitors for 3 days, the flickering black and white images, a tormenting slideshow of his own cowardice. He had watched the empty road, the churning. See the lonely gate expecting nothing. And then there she was, a small, unremarkable car, and inside a woman whose stillness was more powerful than any storm. He zoomed the camera in, his breath catching in his throat. It was her. She wasn't crying, she wasn't demanding, she was just there, a silent vigil. He saw the new resolve in the set of her jaw, the quiet strength in her posture. She had not come back broken. She had come back whole, and her presence was a question that echoed in every silent, empty room of his self-made prison. Are you brave enough to live? The crackle of the intercom broke the silence, Mrs. Davenport's voice a familiar shard of ice. You are trespassing, Ms. Vance. Leave the premises immediately, or the authorities will be summoned. Ilara didn't even glance at the speaker. Her eyes remained fixed on the dark, reflective windows of the house, searching for a sign, a shadow, a flicker of the man she knew was watching. She leaned forward, her voice, calm and clear, carrying through the microphone with unwavering certainty. I'm not here to see you, Mrs. Davenport, she said, her words a quiet challenge that hung in the salty air. Tell Mr. Croft that Ilara is here. She used her first name, a deliberate, intimate claim. It was not a nurse announcing her arrival. It was a woman answering a call that only 2 souls in the world could have possibly heard. He watched the exchange on the screen, a silent God in his lonely heaven. He saw the fury and disbelief on Mrs. Davenport's face, but more importantly, he saw Ilara's complete and utter refusal to be dismissed. She was a force of nature, a quiet tide pushing against the foundations of his fortress. He had sent her away to protect himself from the hope she represented, but her return was a far more dangerous thing. It was a promise of a life that would be messy and painful and real. He stood, his body aching with a pain that was no longer just physical, and walked on, unsteady legs to the main control panel. His hand, the one with the pale, jagged scars, hovered over the illuminated button that controlled the gates. It was the most terrifying and significant decision of his entire life. With a tremor that ran through his entire body, he pressed the button. Outside, a low groan echoed as the heavy gears engaged, and the iron gates began to swing slowly, ponderously inward. They were opening not just a path, but a future. Ilara watched them part, her heart a wild, frantic drum against her ribs. She did not smile. This was not a fairy tale ending. It was a terrifying, beautiful beginning. The path ahead was shadowed and uncertain, filled with the promise of both exquisite joy and profound pain. As the way cleared, she put the car in gear and took her foot off the brake, moving forward to meet the man and the life she had chosen. If you believe in the power of a love that can heal even the deepest wounds, then subscribe, like, and share this story. And let us know in the comments what you would have done.